My M mainly consisted of hyperbolas and parabolas. The edges of the M were two separate hyperbolas, the inner and the outer. The inner hyperbolas were simply a shifted version of the outer hyperbolas, and their restrictions were set at y equals 0, and the points at which they intersected the lower and the upper parabolas correspondingly. As for the top of the M, it was created using two separate parabolas, the upper and the lower. Again, the lower parabola was simply a shifted version of the upper parabola. Moving on to the A, consisted of parabolas and an ellipse. The parabolas simply formed the edges of the A, while the ellipse had formed the center. The parabola's restrictions were set to the point at which they intersected and at y equals 0. And similar things also happened for the inner parabolas, which were only shifted one to the right or one to the left than the outer ones. But the restrictions were also set to the point at which they intersected the ellipses. And the ellipse in the center was also restricted at the points at which it intersected the inner edges, or the inner parabolas. The first N was created using really large ellipses and parabolas. The large ellipses were used to create the edges of the N to make it seem as if it has straight lines. And again, the restrictions were set to the points at which they intersected the slanted parts of the N, or the parabolas. The slanted parts of the N were created using really large parabolas, and similar to their ellipse counterparts, they were restricted to the points at which they intersected with the ellipse, such as here and here. As well as the restrictions were set to y equals 0 and the height of the A. Moving on to the last letter, or the last N, it was created entirely out of circles. These circles had formed the inner and the outer edges of the N, as well as the slanted parts. As for the inner and the outer, they were simply shifted either left or right of one another, but for the slanted parts, they were also shifted horizontally and vertically. One of the things I found to be hardest about this project was definitely shading in the letters. This was because it was difficult to set the right restrictions, and sometimes I had to split it up, like I did here, into different sections to shade it in. Another hard part about this project was simply figuring out the restrictions, and sometimes I even had to use functions